All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murachs, JavaScript, and jQuery 3rd edition as part of the AWD Application and Web Development Web Technologies class. I'm up to Chapter 15 of 18, and as you can see, the chapter is entitled How to Work with Browser Objects, Cookies, and Web Storage. This is another of those chapters that I do not plan on actually covering in class, so I'm only going to be covering the PowerPoints here. That's both for this chapter and for chapters 17 and 18 at a minimum. Okay? So we have two applied objectives. Use the properties and methods of the location and history objects in applications. Use cookies in your applications. Use web storage in your applications. And I think there's 7 knowledge objectives. Describe the href protocol hostname and path properties of the location object. Describe the reload and replace methods of the location object. Describe the back, forward, and go properties, or methods, I should say, of the history object along with the length property. Describe the use of cookies. Distinguish between session cookies and persistent cookies. Describe how to use web storage. Distinguish between web storage, or session storage, I should say, and local storage. All right. Now, the first thing to say about using this location object is it's probably not used as much today as it has been in the past. It's not that this is never used, but there are other ways that you can get this information today. All right. So the location object allows you to work with the URL, Uniform Resource Locator, for a web page. It also lets you control the reloading of the current web page and the loading of new pages. The history object that we'll look at in just a moment lets you work with pages that are stored in your browser's history. So the location object has properties and methods that parse the URL that's put into the address bar. So they figure out where it is you want to go to once you put in an address and you hit the enter key. Here's an example right here. So we want to go, we're using the hypertext transfer protocol. That's the http://. We're going out to the domain in the World Wide Web of Murachs.com. All right, and I may be wrong, but this is probably a port number or server number or something. Underneath there, we're going to the JavaScript folder, and we're finding the location.html file. We are passing in as data probably a first initial of G, and a last, probably a last name of Hopper. And this will give us the result of that. Oh, it's a port number. Okay. So the explanations are down here. I actually looked at this and never looked at that. All right. In the URL, whatever comes after that question mark is referred to as the query string, and it's a series of name value pairs. All right. Now, the two methods of the location object are the reload object, which lets you reload the current page either from the cache memory in the computer or from the server if the force parameter is set to true. There's also the replace method, which allows you to load a new page while replacing the current page in the browser history. And there are some examples of this. The first example here shows 2 ways to use the location object to load a new page into the browser. All right. And the second example that's here shows you how to use the reload method to reload pages. And there's yet another example here that shows you how to use the replace method to load a new page. When the replace method is used to load a new page, the current page in the URL's history is actually overwritten. This can be useful when a page checks to see whether a feature like cookies or Java is enabled and loads different pages depending on the result. So in other words, it's allowing you to do almost the equivalent of some programming in here, at least to use some logic. Now for the history object represents the user's history list of viewed web pages. Because of privacy violations, the amount of information you can get from the history object, sorry about that. So the amount of information that you can get is limited. So the properties and methods of the history object are actually shown here. The length property, as it says, are the number of URLs that you currently have in your history object. Back allows you, it's like hitting the back button on your browser. Forward is like hitting the forward method on your browser. Go allows you to go forward or backward a number of steps or pages in your URL history. And go with some kind of a substring, as it says, goes to the most recent URL in the history that contains that substring. Now the history object becomes an array that holds a history of the pages that have been loaded into the browser. There's really no way to determine what the URLs in the history object are. You can only get the URL of the current page from the location object. All right. The position of the current URL in the history object, because of that, you can't find out if there are pages to go forward to or back to. Now, there have been some limitations of the history object in the past. So with HTML5, what was introduced were two new methods for the history object, and I guess they don't show them here. But they are the push state method and the replace state method. These allow you to add specific information to the history stack, and they're used with AJAX that we talked about in an earlier chapter. So on 440, 441, 442, and 443, the author presents the user interface for a tutorial application that allows you to control what gets put into the history object. What you see here is what the interface will look like. All right, here is most of the HTML. What's not shown here are the CSS file for the application or the link to the jQuery CDN that you would need, all right, to put in probably in the head element. The HTML that's shown here is in the main element for each page. It contains an H1 tag, a P tag, and input elements for buttons. Each button has an ID attribute that's used by the embedded JavaScript to provide the navigation. So in other words, when you look here, other than this page that's got a next, okay, there's no previous right here because there is no previous page, and the last page has got a finish. But basically, the way that this looks, the setup is very similar on each page. The JavaScript is shown on pages 442 and 443. For each page, the JavaScript is in the jQuery ready event handler that we talked about back in Chapter 8. The index.html page has event handlers for the enter and tutorial buttons. The tutorial.html page has an event handler for the next button. That's the tutorial1.html page. The tutorial2.html page has event handlers for the previous, and next buttons. The tutorial3.html page has handlers for the prev or previous and finish button. So when you use this code, you can navigate back and forth between these tutorial pages. And the pages themselves are never stored in the browser's history, which means you can navigate through a one-time tutorial without actually accidentally navigating back to other pages you don't want to go to. That's about it for those two objects. So let's jump into talking about the use of cookies. Now, cookies are basically text files that get written from the web server onto your browser. Okay? For instance, if you've ever gone out to Amazon and you maybe put something, maybe you put something in the shopping cart, maybe you do buy it or maybe you don't buy it. And the next time you go out to Amazon, there might be things out there that says people who bought this book, and they show your book, also bought this kind of book. All right. Sometimes if you go out to a place and it says, "Welcome back, Jeff." All right. That information is put in by a cookie. Now, some web users get concerned because they've heard that cookies do bad things. It's not true. Cookies they're not executable files. They're text files that have a max length of about 4K. So they're just little things that are written to the browser or to the client machine by the server. Now, another reason that people don't like cookies is cookies can be used by advertisers to create third-party cookies, which are kind of, if you've ever had this where you get pop-ups on your screen, all right, that kind of thing. But a cookie really is just a short text string that's stored by the browser as a name-value pair. At a minimum, the cookie has to consist of, it's got to consist of a name and a value. All right? And if a cookie doesn't contain a max age attribute, it's called a session cookie. Okay? So what that means is that if it's a session cookie, by default, the cookie goes away when the session goes away. But I could literally create a cookie and set it to expire in 1,000 years. I won't be here to see it. All right? But again, you could do that. You can also take a cookie and an existing cookie, set its max age to a time in the past, and that'll make the cookie go away. All right? So, again, a cookie, small text string that's stored by the web browser, consists of name-value pairs, must start with a name-value pair that names the cookie and provides a value. The browser usually gets a cookie from the web server as part of an HTTP response. Then it sends the cookie back to the server as part of the HTTP request. A session cookie is deleted when the browser is closed. A persistent cookie remains after the browser has been closed. You can use JavaScript to create cookies, to read existing cookies, and to delete existing cookies. All right. As far as creating cookies, all right, to work with cookies, JavaScript provides a special object called the document.cookie object. So to create a cookie, you first create a text string that represents the cookie. Then you set the document.cookie object equal to the cookie's text string. And we'll see examples of that right here. Two functions for working with cookies include the encode URI, which is Uniform Resource Indicator component, which encodes values that contain semicolons, commas, and white space, and the decode URI component, which decodes values that have been encoded. So cookies cannot have semicolons, commas, or white space, so that's why you use the encode. But if you want to read it, all right, you do the decode. Now you can add multiple cookies to the cookie object by assigning multiple name-value pairs. Each assignment does not each cookie, new one, does not overwrite the old one. It just appends it onto the end. Here's some examples of creating cookies. When you assign a document.cookie object to a variable, the value is stored in a string object. After you do that, you can use the different methods that we talked about back in 13 of the string object to locate the cookie value you want. All right. One method of the string object that's often used with cookies is the split method, which allows you to break a cookie string up into an array of cookies. We'll use that in the next chapter. This manipulation of cookie strings is possible because the cookie string follows a predictable pattern. Again, a persistent cookie is one that you give a max age to in the future. Okay? To delete cookies then, where are we? We give it a date in the past. All right? There are so many different ways that you can do this. You can even come in and set the max age attribute just to 0 if you want to. When you delete a cookie, the data must be empty, but the equal sign is still required. And the path and the domain must match the path and the domain that were used when the cookie was created. There's no way to use JavaScript to determine the path and domain name for a cookie once it's been created. But you can use the applications panel in a browser like Chrome to get that information. All right? So the chapter next, the next 4 pages goes through talking about a task list application. So you put a task in here, You click Add Task and it adds it to a list. Now they're going to refine this, I believe, this example in future chapters. But you click that button and it puts it over here. You click this button and everything that's in here, this looks like a text area, is going to be removed. So the task list application lets the user build a list of tasks to be done and explains the tasks in a text area element. The user can add new tasks to the list or clear out all of the tasks. The tasks are stored in a persistent cookie that's on the user's browser. So this is the user interface. The text box and the two buttons let the user add and delete tasks, and the task list is displayed in the text area element. All right, in the head element of the HTML, there it shows that there's one CSS file that's used in here along with jQuery. In the main element that you can see here, and it goes on to the next page here, the section element contains the text area element that will display the tasks. Here is the associated CSS, and here's the JavaScript. It starts with a jQuery ready event handler, and within this there's three functions that the application uses to work with cookies. The set cookie, get cookie by name, and delete cookie functions are the same as the ones we saw earlier in the chapter. Recall that set cookie accepts a name and a value and an optional number of days, and it creates either a session cookie which expires when the session expires, or if max age is given a value in the future, it makes it a persistent cookie. The get cookie by name function accepts a name and returns either an empty string or the value of the cookie by that name. And the delete cookie function accepts a name and deletes the cookie with that name. Now that was very quick and down and dirty. So let's jump into, in the last few pages in the chapter, we talk about web storage. Now, I'm going to give you a very quick little chronology. It used to be that if you wanted to be able to save anything locally on a machine, you were very limited. The only option you typically had was to use cookies. Cookies have downsides. They're passed to the server in every HTTP request. Their size is typically limited to like 4K, as I said. But now today, most modern browsers offer what's called web storage. And you can think of web storage as kind of being an internal database that you can use right on and with the browser. Then the data isn't passed to the server with every HTTP request. Web storage can typically store approximately 5 meg of data. And web storage includes both local storage and session storage. Local storage is retained indefinitely. Session storage is lost when the session ends by closing the browser or the tab for the page. They start showing you how this stuff works in the figure that you see right here on the screen. To work with local storage, you use the local storage and session storage objects, which store their items in key value pairs, kind of like the cookies that we talked about earlier. Then you use the set item, the get item, the remove item, and the clear methods to work with these particular items. So again, web storage lets the web page use JavaScript to store data in key value pairs. Currently, it's supported by every browser. One type of web storage is local storage, which is retained indefinitely. But again, remember, you only have 5 meg that it can hold. Another type is session storage, which is lost when the user ends the session by either closing the browser or the tab for the page. Web storage is meant to be accessed by JavaScript, not server-side code. That makes it unlike cookies. So web storage isn't passed to the server along with each HTTP request as a cookie is done. You can store, again, up to 5 meg. And to refer to web storage, you use the local storage and session storage items. So there's local storage and there's session storage. So next, on pages 458 and 459, the author comes back and rewrites the task list using web storage, because the first time we did it, it was saving everything in a cookie, all right, which could be tough if you are putting a ton of stuff in your task list, because cookies, again, only 4K. The code is much simpler, and we see the JavaScript code here. The code is simpler because it no longer needs the specialized functions to create cookies, retrieve cookies, and delete cookies. Rather, it uses the methods here, the methods of the local storage object, so that data will persist. It also stores the task list indefinitely. All right. Previously, we set the cookie to last for only 21 days or 3 weeks. There's two more things that you should note about the code here. First, the code uses both full method names and the shortcut syntax. All right. You can use either one, and typically it's just a matter of taste as far as which one you use. Second, the statement that retrieves the tasks from local storage uses an OR operator. I think there it is. An OR operator to set a default value of an empty string if no tasks are retrieved. The HTML for this is the same as the HTML that we saw back in the previous, or earlier in the chapter when we talked about the cookie stuff. All right. And finally, the chapter ends with talking about how to use Chrome to work with items in the browser. Sometimes as you test an application that uses cookies or web storage, it can be helpful to see what values are currently stored. To do that, you can use the application panel of the Chrome browser. And there are similar things for other browsers as well. So this can be useful not only for testing the applications, but for seeing what items other websites are storing in your browser. You can use the technique described here to see the cookies that the application is stored on the browser. Okay, so press F12, which opens Developer Tools. Click on the Application tab at the top of the Tools window and look for the storage section in the left-hand side. Let's see if we can do this. So I'm going to go out to some website. It doesn't matter which one we do. All right, I've got HTML5 pattern here, so I'm going to hit F12. I'm going to click on the Application tab. And then I'm going to look for the storage section in the pane on the left-hand side. All right, there's local storage. And you can see some stuff that's in there. And there is session storage. All right. If we want to work with cookies, we can click the arrow behind. There should be an arrow somewhere in here that also says cookies. There we go. Interesting, because you can see how things are done, all right, when you do this. When you're done, you just hit F12 to make it go bye-bye. Now, if you want to delete a cookie or a web storage item, you can just right-click on the item that where we were just in and choose Delete. Then you'll need to refresh the page to see the result. If you want to edit the web storage item, you right-click on the value and you choose Edit. And again, after you're done, you'll need to refresh the page to see the result. You can use the Application panel in the Chrome Developer Tools to work with cookies and with items in local and session storage. You can delete both cookies and web storage items, but only web storage allows for editing, no cookie editing. And that is it for this chapter. So when I return in just a couple minutes, I will be going over Chapter 16. And Chapter 16, as you can see right here, is on how to work with arrays. So I will be back with that chapter shortly.